How do you convince people that your role in society is of such importance that it's necessary that you have a voice in that same society? Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about it. So stay with me. Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode number 250, Welsh Women, Imagery, and Reality. Victorian Britain liked to paint its regions in stereotypes. Wales, of course, being no exception. In fact, some might argue that they were more than the exception in a lot of expectation. In English newspapers, travel literature, and even in the cartoons of the day, the image of Welsh women became something of a stock figure. She was often imagined as a figure of domestic simplicity, a woman with a tall black hat, a red shawl, a plain dress. This is, of course, the iconic image and costume that we see even today. Obviously, whenever we see women and girls dressing up in what are perceived as culturally Welsh appropriate costume, these are kind of the costumes they end up in. And let me be very clear, so we're all understanding right from the beginning. I'm not saying that costume is wrong, but much like the little sloped cap and the rugby shirts and all the other cute things that kids wear on St. David's Day at school, they are cartoonish, they are stereotypes, and they can be characterizations of people who didn't ever wear that kind of look, didn't necessarily enjoy that style or wear that style, and sometimes it's incredibly dated. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a point where people did, and it doesn't mean that there wasn't a point when people enjoyed that experience and that expression of themselves. But let's be aware that it isn't necessarily the image that people always want to present of themselves. Rather, this iconic costume seemingly owed more to national romanticism than it did to everyday reality, and, as I said, became a shorthand for Welsh identity. But Welsh women of popular imagination obviously were not the picture that we see. Sometimes we see a very different picture in popular culture, such as from satirical magazines such as Punch, that often mocked Welsh women as rough, loud, and domineering, sometimes portraying them in contrast to the more so-called genteel English femininity. These caricatures were part of a broader Victorian tendency to present the people of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland as passionate, unruly, and in need of English order in order to function as a society. The image of Britain's English people as being the civilizing force to the other kingdoms of the United Kingdom, of course, creates this problem. It is obviously something they've then exported in their opinions and images that they create for themselves into other communities and cultures. We'll certainly talk about this a bit later on, that as Britain becomes a colonial power, she brings with her this English idealism that they are civilizing and helping to create a better world because they are taking on, and I'm quoting this because it's quoted, the white man's burden when it comes to helping the so-called lower cultures be able to come out of the darkness and into the light. They started this in Britain, so it's not like this is anything new, but it's just keep in mind. And to again give this a little bit more context, it's something other places in Britain started to adopt as well. The Welsh and the Scottish and the Irish, when they went to other places, were not completely, sitting there and not understanding the culture they've been adapting to over the last numbers of centuries. They understood what being a British person in the Victorian period was, and they would quite frequently take part in this colonial attitude. Again, we've discussed this a little bit, but it's something to keep in mind that while we're pointing out the differences between England and Wales in this particular instance, it's not like all people were suddenly different and everybody believed one thing or the other, or that every image is an accurate presentation, and that for as many people that probably were a part of the colonial mindset, there were probably people who were opposing that colonial mindset. So that's something to keep in mind. And there's nationalism growing in Wales at this point in time that is starting to take hold of the idea that maybe we don't want to be associated with the English idealism all the time. So, again, I just wanted to take that little aside so we come back to the story, not expecting it to be, it much like all of history, nothing's ever simple and nothing is ever straightforward. I mean, we're going to have moments where it's going to seem like that, but it's never that way. It just can't be. At the same time, of course, opposing these comments by the English were the Welsh language poets and writers who often celebrated the women of Wales as moral guardians, a mother and a chapel goer who kept the family steady amidst the turbulence of the industrial age. In the industrial South Wales, where chapels were dominated and community life was centered around women, they were praised for their piety, their thrift, and their dedication to that family. This image, while idealized, gave women a powerful moral authority in everyday life because of this belief. They were, in effect, in charge because that was the image that was given of them. The everyday reality for Welsh women in this Victorian period was far more complex and dynamic than the stereotypes could ever suggest. For working class families, especially in the rapidly industrializing South Wales valleys, survival almost often depended on women's labor. While men might dominate the coal faces underground, women were often visible in the colliery communities as the pit brow lasses. Women were employed above ground in coal sorting, haulage, and surface work. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s show groups of women in heavy skirts and aprons, their hands blackened from coal dust, and the presence a striking rebuke to the idea that women belonged exclusively in the domestic sphere. Beyond the industrial labor, Welsh women were indispensable in the service economy. Tens of thousands worked in domestic service as housemaids, cooks, laundresses, and particularly in the urban centers like Cardiff, Swansea, and Bangor. Others found employment in dressmaking, in millineries, or shopworks. In rural Wales, women's contributions were often tied to agriculture, tending dairy herds, poultry, and gardens, while also managing the household economy. But public life was not defined by labor alone. Women's influence extended deeply into cultural and communal spheres. Nonconformist chapels, which dominated the religious life in Wales, relied heavily on the participation of women. While barred from the pulpit, women taught daily Sunday schools. They ran temperance meetings, something we're going to get into a lot in the next few months. Their role cultivating organizational skills, public speaking ability, and moral authority translated naturally into the reform movements of the day. The temperance campaigns, for instance, often featured female leaders who argued passionately for sobriety as a safeguard for the family welfare and community stability. Philanthropy and education provided another avenue into public life. Wealthier women like Rosemary Crochet used their resources to promote literacy, libraries, and schooling for girls. In working class communities, mothers and chapel women organized penny readings, sewing circles, and relief committees for struggling families. These initiatives did more than offer practical support. They created networks of women who learned to manage funds, coordinate volunteers, and engage with local leaders. By the late 19th century, Welsh women were also beginning to enter professions that gave them more visibility. Teaching, especially in the new elementary schools, established after the 1870 Education Act, became a pathway for several semi-professional status. Female teachers were among the first women to demand equal pay and professional recognition, their campaigns prefiguring later suffrage arguments about fairness and citizenship. And that's where you can kind of see, as women are getting to be more and more involved in the social fabric of society, as they're becoming more and more involved in the day-to-day running of all sorts of different parts of that society, they're starting to realize how negative the situation was for them. And they start to push back on the norms of the day. They start to understand that things are not and should not necessarily be taken as they are. And it's coming from a time period when a lot of people at various levels of economic wealth and poverty are starting to realize that the situation is not a static one and that there should be more movement from one level to the other. You know, the concept of social mobility, never a strong one in Britain to this point, suddenly becomes much more demanding and important. And people are becoming extremely wealthy very quickly out of the blue. And they're becoming what becomes known as the nouveau riche, or the new rich. And it's these people that suddenly start to demand more and more influence and more power. Well, the women who have gone into this and start to, in some cases, gain more and more financial wealth themselves through various reasons, also are starting to see and demand power and see themselves as an arbiter of importance and not to be looked down upon. It is coming from the background of politics, coming from the background of monarchy and other things, into the foreground of the argument, the foreground of the demands. You know, instead of just being the supporting wife of the local MP, she now is starting to imagine that it's unfair that she doesn't have a vote. You know, the young lady who's working to the bone at the various servant quarters, who has to go into the rich household and take care of them, might start to question why she can't move up into that level as well. All of these things are the conflict that is going on in Britain. Quite often when, especially in North America, when we talk about these things, we talk about the American dream, if you want to call it that phrase. But in part, it wasn't as difficult because stratification, while it existed in upper classes and lower classes and middle class, it wasn't as stratified as it was in the old country, if you want to call it that, in Britain. And so it was a lot easier for you to move up and down and it not to be perceived as, you know, lessering yourself, unless you were in the uber wealthy, where, you know, marrying another uber wealthy person was kind of important. For the most part in North America, that didn't matter quite as much. In Britain, it still does at this point. I know family cases of people who were basically shunned because they married below their station. There's that kind of thing going on. Whereas in Canada, the examples I can come up with, and to some extent similarly in the United States, it was more about what religion were you? Where did this person live? What kind of, you know, a number of different reasons why you may or may not, you know, join another family. And certainly some of this is still a part of the British discussion, but it's not the only one. And certainly the stratigraphy and the rigidity of upper, middle, lower still exists for the most part, unless you're in places like Wales, where there's a wide gap between the upper class and then everybody else. And that, I think, was much more common in Wales than it was, say, in England. There wasn't necessarily the same massive middle class that was coming up, that was gaining so much momentum in England. Whereas in Wales, you had this massive industrial rich, the owners of all the industries who were benefiting from the wealth they were generating. But you didn't have like a massive middle class that was growing because Wales wasn't well known for being a great merchant area. There wasn't massive merchant sites and places and importing and exporting, going in and out. Most of the communities in and around Wales were only exporting coal. There wasn't like or steel or bits and pieces, and they were usually going to other British ports, or sometimes they were going to the colonies, and they weren't getting the massive amounts of grain and alcohol and everything else that was coming in from elsewhere that was flooding into England. And so there wasn't this development of a middle and especially an upper middle class that could kind of compete. And this only sort of comes later. And so you don't have that situation. So in a way, it makes it slightly more egalitarian. Doesn't mean it was completely that way. Don't get me wrong. But I would argue that there was probably a lot less of the rigid stratigraphy that you'll see in England in this period, where it was mostly because there was nowhere to go. You know, there was the upper class and then everybody else. And you didn't have tons and tons and tons of middle class merchants just wandering around Wales. They were there, don't get me wrong, but certainly not to the majority of the way they were in England, which I think is part of the reason why you see even today this divergence between the two, because a lot of what Wales had wasn't the same. Now, we can talk about why that is, and we can go into the reasoning for this, but just from the standpoint of talking about it right now, that's kind of where we're at. And you just need to understand that when we discuss these kind of things, that while we might talk about it being a bit more egalitarian, that things were slightly fairer in some respects, doesn't mean it was exactly the same. And that actually it's just egalitarian because everybody's going through the same thing rather than there are levels in the same way. Now, taken together, these roles meant that women were not hidden or silent figures. They were active participants in the economic, social, and cultural life of communities. In fact, their visibility gave them leverage, where suffrage campaigners later argued that women already contributed to the nation in countless indispensable ways. They could point to everyday reality for Welsh women in the collieries, the chapels, the schools, the philanthropic associations as living proof that they were active and interested members of the community. And of course, with this, organized campaigns for women's suffrage in Britain began around the mid-19th century. This was born out of broader currents of liberal reforms, obviously talking about the right to vote for the poor, for the unlanded, who had no voice prior to that. And of course, around that came evangelical morality, temperance, and early feminism. While women had petitioned Parliament as early as 1830, the first real breakthrough came in the 1860s. In 1866, a group of women led by Barbara Leigh Smith Bodichon, Emily Davis, and Elizabeth Garrett gathered thousands of signatures on the first mass women's suffrage petition, which John Stuart Mill, of very famous philosopher, presented to the House of Commons. Mill, one of the leading liberal thinkers of the day, would later argue in his book Subjection of Women that denying the vote to women was both unjust and a waste of national talent. This campaign gave rise to the first of the suffrage societies. In 1867, Lydia Becker founded the Manchester's Women's Suffrage Committee, one of the earliest groups dedicated to the cause. Becker was a tireless organizer, writer, and speaker who encouraged women to step into public life. Her committee linked with other regional societies to form the National Society for Women's Suffrage, which in turn laid the foundations for a more unified national movement. Through the 1870s and 1880s, women like Millicent Garrett Fawcett carried the movement forward. Fawcett became the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which pursued a constitutional and nonviolent strategy, lobbying MPs and publishing pamphlets, and holding meetings to persuade the public. Her calm, logical approach gave the suffrage movement the respectability even amongst skeptics who may have disagreed with it. Other women campaigned for the right in education and employment and property, all of which fed into the demand for the vote. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman doctor in Britain. Her sister, Millicent Fawcett, led the suffrage organization, and women such as Josephine Butler fought against the state regulations on prostitution, insisting that women deserve both legal and political equality. By the 1880s, the suffrage movement was an established part of British political life. Though repeatedly defeated in Parliament, it had become impossible to ignore. This momentum was not confined to England, and we go back to Wales at this point. In Wales, the campaign for education, temperance, and radical liberal reform intersected with the wider suffrage cause. Welsh women read the same pamphlets and attended the same lectures, and sometimes traveled to hear speakers like Lydia Becker or Millicent Fawcett. And by the 1880s, suffrage societies were springing up in Cardiff, Swansea, and Bangor, a reminder that the story of the vote was not just a London affair, but one that reached into every corner of the United Kingdom. By the late 19th century, the suffrage debate was becoming more prominent across Britain, and Wales, of course, was a part of that. One of the earliest platforms for the women's political movement came through the women's liberal associations. Liberalism, of course, was a dominant political tradition in Wales, rooted in nonconformity and opposed to the conservative Anglican power that existed in Britain at the time. For middle-class Welsh women especially, these activities in chapel life and philanthropy meshed well with the liberal politics that offered a natural entry point into the public debate. Women were also speaking at cultural forums like the Eisteddfod. At the 1882 National Eisteddfod in Bala, Elspeth Hughes Davis, known as Mrs. Rees, delivered a paper on women's education. The press recorded Mrs. Rees, quote, in a clever paper, contested the general impression that the amount of education a girl ought to receive was limited, end quote. Here, in the heart of the Welsh cultural institutions, a woman was directly challenging the assumption that women's education should be curtailed, and the newspapers make sure that the readers knew that. The Welsh language writer Ellen Hughes was even more forthright. Responding to Prime Minister Gladstone's opposition to women's suffrage, she wrote, quote, the idea that an elder of wisdoms of Mr. Gladstone should doubt the capacity of the majority of women to vote in an election strikes us as wonderfully astonishing, end quote. Such remarks published in local journals showed that Welsh women were no longer content to remain silent in the face of national debate. Meanwhile, radical liberal editors like John Gibson of the Cambrian News were giving the cause a platform. In his 1891 book, The Emancipation of Women, it was advertised and discussed in the press, and he himself observed, quote, the laws of this country still treat women as inferior of men. It can never be said that the work of a political and social reform is finished until women are not only politically enfranchised, end quote. This combination of Welsh women speaking in public, writing in the press, and their male allies coming forward to give them the spaces needed in the radical publications in order to get their voice out meant that the seeds of suffrage were firmly planted by the 1880s. And just in the following decade, things continued to grow once again. By the 1890s, the suffrage movement in Wales is no longer an isolated idea. It was becoming rather an organized presence with societies, public meetings, and newspaper debates spreading across the country. Branches of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies appeared in Cardiff, Swansea, and Bangor, amongst other communities, working to gather petitions, lobbying members of Parliament, and holding lectures about the reasoning to give the right to vote to women. At the same time, The movements like Cymru Feed were rising under the leadership of people like T.E. Ellis and David Lloyd George, and it was married to the radical liberal movement that had existed before then, and with the politics of cultural nationalism. Along with that, it called for greater Welsh self-government. We've talked a bit about this. Although led by men, Cymru Feed drew in women at grassroots levels. They attended the meetings, they joined the debates, and in many places were welcomed as active participants in those local branches. One of the notable figures, of course, was, and obviously, would be Margaret Lloyd George, wife of David. In Carnarvonshire, she helped to organize meetings, canvassed and mobilized women for the Cymru Feed events. While not a public speaker in her own right, at this point in time, her behind-the-scenes work reflected a broader pattern. Welsh women were learning the mechanics of political organization within a nationalist liberal framework. The involvements mattered because Cymru Feed deliberately cast the Welsh nation in moral and cultural terms, often symbolized through the figures of pure and pious Welsh women. While intended as a rhetorical term, it also gave women a place in the political imagination of the movement and a justification for their presence in its ranks. Meanwhile, prominent professionals like Frances Hogan, one of the first women doctors in Britain, connected the dots between liberal reform and national renewal, and women's rights. Her writings linking suffrage to the broader issues of equality in education and public health helped to extend this idea. The extension of the male franchise in 1884 had already underscored the injustice of women's exclusion. Welsh women pointed out that their brothers and husbands had the vote, while they, who shared the exact same struggles in households and workplaces, continued to remain voiceless. As one of the female commentators put it in the press, mocking the Prime Minister himself, quote, "The idea that an elder of the wisdom of Mr. Gladstone should doubt the capacity of a majority of women to vote in an election strikes us as wonderfully astonishing," end quote. By the end of the century, then, suffrage groups in Wales were no longer curiosities, but part of a wider radical and nationalist ferment. Whether in constitutionalists such as the NUWSS, or the Radical Liberal Women's Association, or in the branches of Cymru Feed, Welsh women were organizing, debating, and shaping the conversation about what kind of nation Wales should be and whether women should have a voice in it. With all that said and done, thank you for listening or viewing today. Thank you for all your support, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will talk again very soon. If you do have questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on most social media at Welsh History Pod, with the exception being Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. As well, if you'd like to help the podcast out financially, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Have a great day. Talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.